If you think that living an extraordinary life requires being born extraordinary, the biblical story of Elijah was written to prove the exact opposite. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a warrior, and he didn't command armies. He was just an ordinary man, yet he carried God's presence so intensely that entire kingdoms were shaken because of him. And here's the paradox. Sometimes the greatest miracles in your life don't depend on the size of your strength, but on the intensity of your heart. Elijah confronted corrupt kings, challenged crowds, called down fire from heaven, and witnessed miracles that today look like scenes from another world. But what most people overlook is that his true greatness wasn't in the spectacle, it was in the secret place. He lived moments of courage, but he also walked through fear, loneliness, silence, and rebuilding. And it's this very mixture that makes his journey so similar to ours. Fragile, intense, and full of twists only God can weave together. What would happen if you discovered that the same presence that sustained Elijah is available to you right now? That the same voice that guided him on Mount Carmel can also guide your steps today? That the same strength that lifted him in the desert can lift you as well? This is the promise few people notice. But once it becomes real, it changes everything. So stay with me until the end, because this video might awaken a faith inside you that has been asleep and reignite something you didn't even know you had lost. And before we continue, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, activate the notifications, and walk with me on this journey of spiritual depth and transformation. Here, you won't find shallow content, you'll find direction. The first lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is about courage to confront sin. The biblical story describes his encounter with Ahab and Jezebel as a moment when truth could no longer be ignored. Among the biblical characters, Elijah appears as someone who understands that silence also has consequences. Confronting wrongdoing is not an act of pride, but an act of spiritual protection. It resembles moments when someone must set boundaries to prevent a harmful situation from continuing to grow. The Bible shows that this courage is not aggressive, but firm. Elijah does not confront to humiliate, but to restore what was being lost. A practical example of this lesson appears when someone chooses to face a destructive pattern at home, or work not to accuse, but to begin healing. This posture connects with anyone who has discovered that speaking the truth can save a relationship. Elijah's courage lights the path of responsible honesty. The second lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is faithfulness to God in times of apostasy. The biblical story reveals a divided people, embracing practices that weakened their bond with the covenant. Even so, Elijah remained firm, refusing to be shaped by the environment around him. Among biblical characters, he stands out for not adjusting his faith to fit cultural pressure. He reflects someone who keeps their values intact, even when the world seems to move in the opposite direction. This faithfulness also teaches that maintaining principles has a cost, but it produces lasting fruit. The Bible shows Elijah standing alone before an entire nation, yet he does not retreat. In practical life, this lesson applies to ethical decisions, such as maintaining transparency at work or refusing questionable shortcuts. It resembles someone who chooses to study honestly for an exam, even knowing others might cheat. True faithfulness is quiet, but powerful. The third lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is immediate obedience to the voice of the Lord. In the biblical story, when God sends him to Kerith and later to Zarephath, Elijah simply goes. There are no negotiations or attempts to propose alternative paths. This obedience reveals a heart trained to trust before understanding. And often, in real life, this translates into accepting unexpected changes that lead to growth. The Bible highlights that every instruction Elijah receives prepares him for something greater. Kerith teaches dependence. Zarephath teaches miracle. Among the biblical characters, few display such readiness so clearly. It resembles someone who accepts a new job, begins a challenging course, or takes a necessary step to rebuild areas of life. Quick obedience often opens doors that hesitation keeps locked. The strength of this lesson lies in the simplicity of the act. These three lessons connect and shape Elijah's character throughout the biblical story. Courage, faithfulness, and obedience form a foundation strong enough to sustain anyone in difficult times. When someone chooses to face truth, uphold integrity, and act promptly, they build a life aligned with their purpose. These principles become anchors in moments of doubt, insecurity, or pressure. And it's interesting how each lesson prepares the heart for the challenges to come. Among the biblical characters, Elijah becomes a reference because he does not live only extraordinary moments, but a daily life guided by conviction. His journey shows that great transformations begin with seemingly simple decisions. Whether confronting wrongdoing, staying faithful, or obeying without delay, each step shapes destiny. The biblical narrative presents Elijah as a mirror for those who seek maturity and depth in their walk. These lessons form only the beginning of this remarkable prophet's journey. They introduce principles that deepen further when Elijah is taken into the desert, a place where total dependence becomes more than a concept. It becomes survival itself. And it is in that quiet, rugged landscape that new and profound truths begin to unfold, preparing the heart for everything that is about to come next. The fourth lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is to trust in divine provision. The biblical story shows God sustaining Elijah through ravens at the brook of Kerith, and later through the miracle of oil in the widow's house in Zarephath. Among the biblical characters, few experience dependence this literally. This lesson echoes today, when someone must trust that, even when resources seem to vanish, provision will come in unexpected ways. It is a call to rest in divine direction, when logic offers no solutions. The Bible shows that this provision does not depend on human strength, but on God's faithfulness. Elijah did not need to chase alternative sources of survival. He only needed to follow the instruction he received. This inspires practical actions, such as reorganizing finances while trusting that wise steps will produce results, or beginning a project with confidence that if God inspired it, resources will appear. The central point is that provision is not random, it is a response to a walk of faith. This fourth lesson also reminds us that divine provision may come from unlikely sources. In the biblical story, ravens, birds that would hardly feed anyone, become instruments of care. And a poor widow becomes the key to a miracle. This logic challenges modern expectations, like when opportunities come from unexpected places or unlikely people open significant doors. Elijah teaches that human limits do not limit God. The fifth lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is to learn to live by the supernatural. Among the biblical characters, Elijah is one who walks most clearly in a dimension where the impossible becomes natural. His journey reveals that God is not restricted by circumstances and that trusting the unseen is part of spiritual growth. This applies when someone chooses to persist in a purpose even without seeing immediate results. Like Elijah, faith walks before signs appear. The Bible shows that living by the supernatural does not mean ignoring reality, but interpreting it with trained eyes. Elijah does not deny the desert, but he knows the desert does not define the outcome. Many people experience something similar when they continue studying despite a lack of opportunities, seek emotional help despite slow progress, or work to restore a worn-down relationship. Faith acts like a horizon that doesn't move, even when the road changes. This fifth lesson teaches that the supernatural becomes visible as trust becomes consistent. The biblical story shows that before the miracle, there is surrender. Elijah, living in Kerith and Zarephath, never demanded explanations. He simply walked. Today, this translates into actions such as forgiving before feeling ready, sowing before seeing results, or acting before having absolute certainty. Faith, as in Elijah's story, moves first so the miracle can follow. The sixth lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is compassion and intercession for those in need. The Bible describes the moment when the widow's son dies, and Elijah places himself in intense prayer. Among biblical characters, he appears as someone who does not remain indifferent to another's pain. This lesson highlights the importance of taking action when someone nearby needs support, whether emotional, spiritual, or even financial. Compassion becomes a bridge for the miracle God performs. The biblical story shows that this compassion is not just feeling, but action. Elijah cries out for the boy's life, demonstrating that intercession is an active expression of love. In everyday life, this inspires actions, such as truly listening to someone, offering practical help, or dedicating time to pray for those going through crises. Just as Elijah involved himself deeply, compassion transforms environments and revives hope. These three lessons from the desert expand our understanding of who Elijah is among the biblical characters. They show a prophet shaped by dependence, faith, and love in a quiet and isolated setting. And this preparation becomes essential for what would come next, one of the most striking confrontations in the biblical story, where the power of prayer would be revealed in an extraordinary way on Mount Carmel. The seventh lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is about fervent and effective prayer. The biblical story highlights that before rain returned to Israel, Elijah bowed in deep intercession. Among the biblical characters, his posture shows that prayer is not just words, but complete surrender. He persists 7 times, teaching that perseverance is part of the process. This applies when someone chooses to keep praying, studying, or working even when results have not yet appeared. The Bible shows that Elijah's prayer is not rushed. It is born from conviction. He seeks not formulas, but relationship. This lesson inspires simple practices such as setting daily times for prayer or dedicating moments to meditate on biblical passages. Like Elijah, creating consistency strengthens faith. It is similar to someone learning an instrument. The more consistent the practice, the more sensitive the ear becomes to the right sound. Elijah's prayer also teaches that the miracle is sometimes closer than a person imagines. In the biblical story, his servant sees only a small cloud, but Elijah already discerns it as the sign of God's answer. This resembles situations where small advances, a shift in behavior, emotional improvement, or an opening in a professional opportunity indicate that something bigger is on its way. Faith learns to celebrate small signs. The eighth lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is absolute confidence in the supremacy of God. On Mount Carmel, he challenges the prophets of Baal without hesitation because he knows God will answer. Among biblical characters, few display such assurance in the face of opposition. This confidence grows from a deep knowledge of who God is. It inspires practical attitudes, such as staying firm in correct decisions, even when others doubt. When identity is secure, pressure loses power. The biblical story shows that Elijah does something even more surprising. He pours water over the altar before the fire descends. This action removes any possibility of human manipulation and highlights his trust. In everyday life, this mirrors choices that require faith, such as building a business with integrity, beginning a challenging course without guarantees, or seeking reconciliation before knowing the outcome. True confidence appears in details that reveal surrender. The Bible also reveals that the confrontation on Carmel is not about spectacle but restoration. Elijah knows God does not need proofs for himself, but the people need to remember who truly governs. This echoes modern situations where someone must reaffirm principles within family, work, or community, not out of pride, but to rebuild what has been broken. The supremacy of God brings clarity when everything seems confused. The ninth lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is that restoring the altar is restoring life. In the biblical story, before the fire descends, Elijah rebuilds the broken altar. Among biblical characters, this symbolic act teaches that the miracle begins when what is in ruins is reordered. It resembles someone who chooses to reorganize emotions, habits, or priorities before expecting major change. Spiritual order often reflects in practical order. The Bible emphasizes that restoring the altar means putting every piece back in its place, starting with the heart. Elijah uses 12 stones, representing the tribes of Israel, reminding that the people's identity was fragmented. This applies when someone realizes they need to rebuild discipline, reorganize their schedule, or restore their spiritual life. Simple steps, such as returning to read the biblical story daily, reignite flames that once seemed extinguished. These 3 lessons reveal how Elijah, among all biblical characters, embodies a mature spirituality that unites prayer, confidence, and restoration. But even someone so strong spiritually would face a surprising season of vulnerability. And it is at that point that his journey becomes even more human, preparing the way for us to understand how even the greatest prophets face fear, loneliness, and the need for renewal. The 10th lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is that men of God also face emotional crisis. The biblical story describes how, after the confrontation on Mount Carmel, Elijah flees into the desert in fear of Jezebel. Among the biblical characters, he appears here in a profoundly human way, showing that even those mightily used by God can feel exhausted. This lesson teaches that vulnerability is not weakness. It is part of the journey, and in many cases, acknowledging this pain becomes the beginning of healing. The Bible makes it clear that Elijah lies under a broom tree and wishes to give up. This scene reveals the intensity of the emotional weariness he was experiencing. This lesson applies when someone, even after great victories, faces an unexpected emptiness. It may happen after completing a difficult project, resolving a family challenge, or overcoming a long-standing conflict. Emotions blend with fatigue, and the person feels they lack strength to continue. Elijah shows that this also happens to strong people. The biblical story presents God caring for Elijah in practical ways: food, rest, and direction. This part teaches that emotional healing does not always begin with dramatic revelations, but with simple gestures. Today, that may mean reorganizing sleep, seeking counseling, or reducing responsibilities to regain balance. Just as with Elijah, basic steps create space for strength to return. Divine care is often expressed through details. The 11th lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is that God speaks softly to heal the soul. On Mount Horeb, he does not reveal himself in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire, but in a gentle whisper. Among biblical characters, this is one of the most striking scenes of spiritual sensitivity. The Bible teaches that God's voice is not always loud or forceful. Often, it comes tenderly. This inspires practices such as seeking moments of silence, reading peacefully, and engaging in deep reflection. A wounded heart hears more clearly in a quiet environment. This lesson reveals that not every divine answer arrives suddenly or dramatically. Many times, what heals is what arrives quietly. It may come through a line read in a book, an unexpected piece of advice, or a piece that appears without explanation. As Elijah discovered, God's whisper guides without pressure. Practically, cultivating calm and attention allows someone to perceive directions previously overlooked. The biblical story teaches that God speaks to restore, not to overwhelm. The Bible also shows that change does not come only through revelation, but through presence. On Horeb, Elijah realizes that God had not abandoned him, even when he felt entirely alone. This awareness strengthens the soul. In practical terms, this suggests that healing can also come through allowing trustworthy people or a spiritual mentor to walk alongside us. Just as God remained with Elijah, no one needs to face crises in isolation. The 12th lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is that no one fulfills their mission alone. The biblical story shows God reminding Elijah that 7,000 had not bowed to Baal. Among the biblical characters, this revelation emphasizes that loneliness is often a perception, not a reality. Elijah discovers that a faithful remnant stands firm in the same covenant. This teaches that even when we feel alone, we are not truly without support. God also directs Elijah to anoint Elisha as his successor, showing that the continuation of the mission does not depend on a single individual. This lesson inspires practical actions such as teaching others, sharing responsibilities, or delegating important tasks. In family, workplace, or community settings, it translates into raising new leaders and passing on knowledge. A mission grows stronger when shared, not when carried by one person alone. These 3 lessons reveal a tender side of Elijah, showing that among the biblical characters, even the strongest face exhaustion and need renewal. Yet it is precisely in this vulnerable process that the stage is set for something even greater in the biblical story, a legacy that surpasses generations and points toward eternal realities, which unfolds in the next chapter. The 13th lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is to live a life that inspires future generations. The biblical story shows that his impact reaches across centuries. even influencing John the Baptist, who came in the spirit and power of Elijah. Among biblical characters, few carry such a lasting influence. This lesson teaches that the value of a life is not only in visible achievements, but in the mark it leaves on others. Just as mentors inspire new leaders, Elijah becomes a reference for anyone who desires to leave a legacy that endures. The Bible reveals that Elijah's influence does not come only from miracles, but from consistent faithfulness. His steadfastness in difficult times created a model for those who came after him. This lesson applies to simple situations in everyday life, such as teaching solid values to children, sharing wisdom with friends, or guiding someone early in their career. A legacy is not built only through grand gestures, but through daily consistency. Elijah shows that an upright life echoes beyond time. The biblical story reinforces that a legacy does not need to be perfect to be powerful. Elijah had fears, fled, and felt exhausted, yet his journey formed a strong testimony. Among biblical characters, this demonstrates that God uses real people, not idealized figures. In practical terms, this inspires anyone who struggles with weaknesses, reminding them that perseverance in what is right bears fruit. Every right choice becomes a seed planted in someone's future. And one day, that seed grows. The 14th lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is to be an instrument of justice and revival. The Bible narrates how his life confronts idolatry and rekindles Israel's faith. Among biblical characters, Elijah rises as a catalyst who awakens a spiritually sleeping nation. This lesson teaches that when someone stands for what is right, change begins to happen around them. It is similar to a person choosing to act ethically, influencing their entire team or household. In the biblical story, Elijah does not seek recognition, he seeks restoration. His confrontation with the prophets of Baal is not a battle for power, but a call for the people to return to truth. This lesson applies in environments where someone must bring clarity, balance, or truth. It may be by leading a group, setting healthy boundaries at home, or making decisions that lift the morale of everyone involved. Like Elijah, those who act with justice help rekindle what seemed extinguished. The Bible shows that the revival Elijah brings does not occur only in dramatic moments, but also in the simple act of rebuilding the altar. Among biblical characters, this image reveals that justice and revival begin with inner reorganization. It reminds us that before transforming the external environment, the heart must be transformed. Small habits such as studying regularly, practicing gratitude, or strengthening spiritual life create foundations for greater change. The 15th lesson we learn from the prophet Elijah is to wait faithfully for the eternal reward. The biblical story describes his extraordinary departure. A chariot of fire carries him to heaven, marking a unique ending among biblical characters. This lesson teaches that faithfulness has a glorious destiny, even when it is not immediately visible. Just as someone works for years toward a dream that is fulfilled only in the future, Elijah reminds us that enduring rewards require perseverance. The Bible presents this final scene as a reminder that life does not end within earthly limits. Elijah passes through the biblical story as someone who lived his purpose intensely and therefore received a remarkable reward. This lesson inspires actions such as cultivating hope, maintaining faith during difficult seasons, and continuing to build a meaningful life. Waiting for the eternal reward guides daily choices, even when the road seems long. These 3 lessons reveal the climax of Elijah's journey, showing how a prophet marked by courage, dependence, and sensitivity completes his mission with glory and purpose. Among biblical characters, his story stands as a lighthouse for those who want to live with impact. And after exploring such a powerful legacy, a natural desire arises to unite everything learned, opening the space for the introduction that will tie the entire message together. When we look at Elijah's journey in the biblical story, it becomes impossible to ignore how deeply his life was marked by the presence of God. Among all the biblical characters, he stands out not only because of the miracles, but because of the intimacy he cultivated with the Creator. Elijah lived, guided, corrected, strengthened, and renewed by God, and that made all the difference in every phase of his walk. His story reminds us that a transformed life does not grow from human effort alone, but from a heart that chooses to remain close to the Father. This reflection calls us into something profound, to turn our hearts back to God, just as Elijah did. In a world full of distractions, doubts, and pressure, communion with God becomes the refuge that sustains, guides, and shapes our identity. When we make space for His voice, we find direction. When we surrender our fears, we find rest. When we lift our eyes, we realize we are not alone. Elijah shows that walking with God does not mean living without challenges. It means having strength to overcome them. And now, a simple yet powerful question remains. What atmosphere do you want to carry in your life? The same one that surrounded Elijah, filled with faith, courage, dependence, and intimacy, is still available to anyone who chooses to seek God wholeheartedly. Start with small steps. Read the Bible intentionally. Pray daily. Create moments of silence. Strengthen your spirit. God is not distant. He is waiting to be invited back to the center of your life. Let me leave you with a direct question. Which lesson from Elijah inspires or impresses you the most? His courage? His obedience? His total dependence on God? Or perhaps the way God restored him at his lowest moment? Share it in the comments. I truly want to know what spoke to your heart. These conversations build a living community that grows and learns together. And of course, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and keep walking with me on this journey of wisdom, faith, and transformation. There is still so much to learn, and I want you here for every step of this story. The Bible leads this biblical story to a point that many overlook. What happens after a great spiritual victory? The fire has already fallen. The people have already confessed that the Lord is God, but the sky is still closed. The sacred text moves forward in First Book of Kings, chapter 18, showing that a supernatural experience does not end the journey of faith. The prophet Elijah understands that victory does not replace dependence. Elijah announces that there is the sound of abundant rain, even when there are no visible clouds. The Bible records this moment in First Book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 41. This biblical story reveals that faith does not live by what it sees, but by what God has promised. The prophet Elijah does not confuse promise with automatic fulfillment. Next, Elijah goes up to the top of Mount Carmel and places himself in a posture of prayer. The Bible describes in First Book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 42, that he bowed down to the ground and put his face between his knees. This biblical story shows that the greater the revelation, the greater the humility must be. The prophet Elijah teaches that intimacy is not built in spectacle, but in the secret place. The prayer is not answered immediately. Elijah sends his servant to look toward the sea, and nothing appears. The Bible reports that this happens repeatedly. This biblical story reveals that perseverance is an essential part of mature faith. The prophet Elijah does not give up in the silence because he understands that God also works in the waiting. On the seventh time, a small cloud appears, about the size of a man's hand. The Bible records this in First Book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 44. This biblical story teaches that God often begins great works in small ways. The prophet Elijah recognizes that this is enough to act in faith. The seventh lesson we learn about the true God is that faith perseveres even after great experiences. God does not call us only to live supernatural moments, but to remain dependent on Him every day. The Bible shows that fire does not eliminate the need for rain. This biblical story reveals that consistency is more valuable than isolated intensity. The prophet Elijah lives this truth to the very end. The rain finally comes, ending the season of drought. The Bible declares that the sky grew dark, the wind rose, and a heavy rain fell. This biblical story shows that God is faithful to fulfill what He promises. The prophet Elijah witnesses that perseverance turns promise into reality. This final act on Mount Carmel teaches that spiritual life does not end at the peak, it continues in daily faithfulness. The Bible closes this biblical story by showing that after the fire and the rain, the walk with God goes on. The prophet Elijah points out that true faith does not live on events, but on constant relationship. And so the journey does not end. It simply enters a new season. As you walk through this biblical story in the light of the Bible, you begin to see that Mount Carmel is not just a geographical place, but a reflection of every person's spiritual journey. Each scene reveals something about who God is and how the human heart responds to truth. The prophet Elijah is not merely a figure from the past. He becomes a voice that crosses time and speaks directly to you today. Carmel showed us that God confronts indecision, demands a decision, exposes the emptiness of idols, restores the altar, responds to simple faith, reveals Himself unmistakably, and calls us to persevere even after victory. The Bible makes it clear that true faith is not built on isolated moments, but on a continuous walk of obedience and dependence. This biblical story does not end with applause. It ends with transformation. Now, the question is no longer what God did on Carmel, but what He wants to do in your heart. Which of these lessons spoke most deeply to you? Was it the confrontation with indecision, the need to restore the altar, or the call to persevere even after powerful encounters with God? The Bible was not written merely to be read, but to be lived. The prophet Elijah shows us that every revelation demands a response. Take this reflection into your daily life. Examine your choices, your priorities, and your spiritual consistency. Allow God to take His rightful place again, not only in words, but in daily decisions. The biblical story of Carmel continues every time someone chooses to serve the Lord alone, and the Bible assures us that God still responds to those who truly surrender. If this message strengthened you and helped you grow spiritually, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue walking with us through deeper studies of the Bible. And now, leave a comment. Which lessons spoke most to your heart and why? Your response may encourage others who are also on this journey of faith.